You found the skeleton. How would you tell it to die? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Ah, welcome. Please come in. No, Dapper Dinosaur will be back. He came through my world stone a few days ago, cleared out some pesky neighbors, and asked if I could make a video for him. I agreed, so here I am. We're back taking a look at Jennifer Hall Rivera's talk about things science just can't explain, given to an audience at what I believe is the Creation Museum Auditorium. We just got done being told that we can see that organisms only reproduce after their kind, without, of course, being told what a kind is, or what it would look like if it didn't. Now, we're going to be given examples of monophily in evolution. Then Hall Rivera is going to pretend that that means that evolution is false, even though everything she's talking about is completely in line with how evolution works.
We can see dogs only having more dogs, can't we?
Yes, we can. And, as Dapper said, that's just monophily in action. So, what is monophily? It is the idea that the descendants of a common ancestor can't ever be not descendants of that ancestor, and that if we are to base taxa on common ancestry, each taxon should include all and only the descendants of a common ancestor. So, on screen is what I call a monophily simulation. One main trunk splits 4 times, resulting in 16 tips, representing species in this model emerging from the trunk. Now, here's what the first creationists thought, where each species is a separate creation. Now, creationists recognize that some species do actually share common ancestry, and they base this on things like genetic similarity and differences in the morphological similarities and differences. The problem is that the same techniques can get you back to here, where even more species are shown to share common ancestry. And unless you halt at an arbitrary number, you end up back where we started with universal common ancestry. And that's fundamentally the problem with rejecting species fixity in favor of created kinds. All you can do is accept evolution, but then pretend that it does not work before some arbitrary stopping point.
We can see elephants only having more elephants.
Do I have to break out the tree again? I'll do it if I have to.
Right? We see this all throughout the plant kingdom and animal kingdoms, is that we can predict what these animals are going to have within this orchard of life that God created.
When you accept evolution, you can use it to make predictions about future data. That's true. Here's something else that's cool. If you don't just pretend that evolution has some arbitrary stopping point past which common ancestry stops, then you can predict even more, such as when Tiktaalik was discovered by that Neil Shubin, after predicting that he'd find a transitional form between fully aquatic stenopterygian fish and tetrapods in the frozen hellscape of Arctic Canada. Or as I call it, Canada! Turns out he did it.
Now, interestingly enough, the Human Genome Project was a 15-year study where some of our top geneticists in the world were attempting to map out the human genome.
Yup, and the results were then used along with the results of the Chimpanzee Genome Project to show that humans' closest genetic relatives are the members of genus Pan. Like me. No, it's chimpanzees. Different Pan. That is the common chimpanzee and the bonobo. And they're closer to each other than lions and tigers are genetically. So, bit of a problem if you want common ancestry for all felids, which AIG does. But you also want separate ancestry for humans versus other apes, which AIG also does.
They had a quote on their website that is no longer there. And the first time I saw it, I was just like, wow, that's so simple, but yet it's so profound and directly confirms God's word. And here's what it said.
Who wants to bet that it's not actually going to be evidence that humans are a separate creation from all the other life that is on the earth, and that the earth is only 6,000 years old?
And so we all know that elephants only give birth to elephants, giraffes to giraffes, dogs to dogs, and so on for every type of living creature. That was one of the conclusions of the 15-year study of the DNA code of life. What did they see?
They saw monophyly, just like they were supposed to, just like evolution logically requires.
Well, dogs are only going to have dogs, aren't they? Cats are only going to have cats. How does that confirm God's word? Genesis chapter 1, right? Tells us 10 times in the very first book of the Bible, God clearly tells us exactly how he created living things, and that is exactly what we observe today in nature.
Hey, it's true. In a case where the predictions of answers in Genesis and science aren't at odds, we see the predictions fulfilled. How shocking, but also very uninformative.
Now, we're going to go back to Richard Dawkins here.
No, we're not. I, like Dapper, don't care about Richard Dawkins. He's still not the king of evolution, or the pope of atheism, or whatever. If anything, he's done more to make atheists sound like idiots than anyone I can think of with his agnostic atheism scale nonsense that has done nothing but make communication between atheists and others confused, tricked numerous non-atheists into thinking that they are atheists, and made it so that online atheist communities don't even know what words like belief, knowledge, and confidence mean. Oh, on top of that, he's a transphobe, so he can go sit on the corner in Turf Island.
Profound, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's just some old man whose competence in philosophy rivals Roger from Mud Fossil U's competence in, well, everything. Saying that he thinks evolution means there's no creator. I don't care.
So let's break this down a little bit and talk about, well, what is natural selection?
Now that's a good question. So the first thing to know is that organisms don't all reproduce with the same success as their conspecifics. This is easy to demonstrate. Just think about your friends and family. You almost certainly know people who've had 0 children, a single child, or multiple children. Next is the fairly obvious fact that some organisms reproduce less or fail to reproduce because of something external to them or internal to them. For example, perhaps they are eaten, or they simply don't reproduce as many gametes as another member of their species. This means that the traits of those organisms that reproduce more will be more common in the next generation, assuming those traits are governed by that organism's genetics. That's it. That's natural selection. Those organisms which reproduce more than average are said to be selected for, and those that reproduce less than average are said to be selected against. There is no entity making choices here. That's important. There is in fact nothing actively making selections. This is an anthropomorphism, which makes it easy to talk about this phenomenon, but it's not literal. And yes, I'm talking to you, Randy Galuza.
Because you're going to find this often with Richard Dawkins and many evolutionists, is they equate natural selection and evolution as the same thing, and they almost use them interchangeably.
That is like saying that someone is conflating touchdowns and American football. If you're talking about touchdowns, you're talking about American football. But you can talk about other aspects of football too. Natural selection is a very important aspect of evolution. It's not the only aspect, and other aspects are vital to the theory. But if you're talking about natural selection, you're talking about evolution.
Natural selection is a loss of information.
First, yes, I recognize how stupid the graphic on screen is, but I will talk about it more and when and if she actually talks about it. Second, once again, we have no way to measure information as creationists mean it, so that's meaningless. Now, natural selection does serve to reduce genetic diversity. There is no evolutionary biologist that doesn't know that. That's like high school level biology information. Mutation adds to genetic diversity. Pretty much all the other mechanisms of evolution, apart from epigenetics, reduce genetic diversity, including sexual selection and genetic drift.
So we can see in the original dog kind. Now, of course, we don't know what the original dog kind looked like.
Well then, we can't see anything in the original dog kind, can we? But also, what do we do with the animals that are almost canines but aren't? Like the borophagine or bone-crushing dogs. or the Hesperocyanins that were in many ways weasel-like, or so primitive it could almost be the common ancestor of all carnivorans, Miosis. See, once again, we are just arbitrarily cutting off the common ancestry. Also, what is it with young Earth creationists and canines? I mean, I like doggos too, but they seem to only talk about two groups of animals, apes and canines. They do know that bears, flatworms, and amphipods, among so many other groups, exist, right?
We've done a lot of research into that, but let's just imagine we have a wolf like you see here.
So now we're talking about this inane diagram with a wolf Canis lupus at the top, presumably with the most information, followed by a coyote, Canis latrans, then an African painted dog, Lacayon pictus, then a golden jackal, Canis aureus, and finally a dingo, Canis lupus familiaris dingo, which apparently has the least information. I have no idea what gave them the idea that those animals have different amounts of information in the first place. Never mind how they decided that they were in that order. Is it just genetic diversity? Do dingoes have more pseudogenes than coyotes? Is it the genome size of the African painted dog is bigger than that of the jackal? I have no idea, and the thing is that neither do they, because any actual definition they gave of information would immediately show that, in fact, mutation can add information to the genome. If they want to say it's the number of functional genes, we can show study after study of organisms that have evolved novel genes. Is it genome size? That too is easy to show increasing. Just look at the evolution in the 1990s of Procambarus virginalis from Procambarus phallax via whole genome duplication, resulting in a 50% bigger genome. Is it anatomical complexity? That seems unlikely, since all the animals shown have the same parts. In fact, if anything, the dingo should be higher, because being a feral dog, it actually has a few extra facial muscles that other canines lack that allow them to have a more expressive faces to better communicate with humans. So that, in and of itself, demonstrates the ability of the canine lineage to get more complex morphologically. This is the problem with the information argument. The minute it becomes a real argument, that is, the word information is given a clear definition, the argument is easily refuted. That's why creationists are so vague with it. Also, I want to point out that the relationship between the pictured canines is not that each one evolved into the next. The cladogram would actually look more like this.
And then as dogs breed, and we have, over 500 different dog breeds today.
Dog breeds have artificially low genetic diversity compared to wild animals because humans are incredibly restrictive in their breeding pool. They are a poor example organism for evolution because of how strange humans have made their morphologies and breeding pools. Basically, dogs have been humans' genetic playthings for thousands of years, and it shows.
You could definitely say that from the original kind of dog to a poodle, there's been a loss of information.
Only if by loss of information we mean that the genetic diversity of poodles as a breed is lower than that of all non-dog wolves. But again, mutation of logical necessity raises genetic diversity. So, if that's what is meant, that means that increasing the information is trivial for evolution. This kind of negates the whole information argument.
Right? Would we all agree, right?
No.
Clearly a loss of genetic information.
How so? Do poodles have fewer genes than wolves? Dogs and wolves both have about 2.4 megabase genomes. They have the same basic anatomy, with that of the poodle even being a bit more complex with extra facial muscles. If anything, I'd say that by having more muscles in its body, the poodle seems to have more information than the wolf. But then, of course, we still don't have a definition for information that would let us quantify the different amounts of information in any two organisms.
Or if you think from the original cat kind or a lion to a house cat, there's a loss of information here.
Why? Because house cats are smaller? What if I say lions have less information because they can't purr on both the inhale and exhale, while domesticated cats can? If it's size, does that mean that the Mastiff has more information than the Wolf? Since wolves max out at about 81.5 kilos, but Mastiffs max out at about 104? Do the Dutch, with their average height of nearly 176 centimeters, have more information than the Han Chinese, with their average height of 161 centimeters? Is it just that animals that are domesticated have less information arbitrarily? When does this begin? Do captive populations of leopard geckos have less information, even if they're wild type, than do their captive relatives in Iran, Pakistan, and India?
And this is natural selection.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
Both domesticated dogs and domesticated cats are primarily examples of artificial selection. You know, because they're domesticated.
We can directly observe this in the animal populations as we do see change within animal kinds.
Yes, and if that change comes from a change in allele frequencies across generations, then it's evolution by definition, since that is what evolution is, whether or not universal common ancestry is true.
But it is always a loss of information.
If we can't measure the information, we can't tell if it's a loss of information. And we already saw that at least all the obvious options for measuring information don't work, whether it be anatomical complexity, genome size, or gene number.
What does evolution require?
A population of organisms that can reproduce with genetic material can mutate. That's it.
Evolution requires a gain of information.
It doesn't by any definition, and since there's no definition, then I'm going to say that evolution requires a gain in information the same way that Christianity requires a gain in confirmation, which is a word I just made up and will not define. But unless you can convince me that confirmation is going up in each Christian, then sorry, but Christianity is just false.
It requires an organism to literally, miraculously gather new information and then become a different organism.
So, whatever information is, creationists always talk about it as if it's part of the genome. So, it's in the DNA, which is subject to mutation. What prevents mutations that add to the information of the organism? Did that notothenoid fish gain information when it got a new protein without losing an old one? Did dogs gain new information when they evolved 2 new facial muscles? What would prevent mutations which would increase information? And if information is in the genome, then it's not gathered miraculously or not, it's generated at the level of the DNA. No miracle required, just chemistry. This isn't the creature stage of spore. But also, this isn't a requirement of evolution. Any population of organisms that can reproduce and whose genetic material can mutate will of necessity evolve, even if only at the molecular level and not the morphological level.
This has never been observed in nature, ever.
Just like I've never observed a Christian increasing their confirmation, which, I have to say, it is a pretty serious blow to Christianity. I'm not sure how the church will recover. I mean, I might need to call like Pope Francis, Pope Tawadros, and Patriarch Bartholomew, and like for Protestants, Joel Osteen? I don't know. I gotta tell them the jig is up.
We see loss of information, yes, and we would agree there is natural selection within created kinds.
Maybe we see that, but how would we know?
But there is absolutely never been any living thing that has gained new information and become a completely different organism that would be required for evolution.
You know, this comes up a lot with creationists, where they will require as evidence of evolution things that would in fact go a long way to disconfirming evolution, or describe evolution in a way that actually ends up being more like special creation than like evolution. We've already talked about monophily, but it means that fundamentally organisms do not just transition into completely different organisms. vertebrates stay vertebrates, mammals stay mammals, apes stay apes. That's why humans are vertebrates, mammals, and apes. Evolution proceeds by variation on what is already there. To have a vertebrate turn into like a crustacean or something would violate the most basic aspects of evolution, and if it were found, it would be a strong evidence against evolution.
Mutations, everything that we see in creation as effects of the fall are all a loss of genetic information.
So, when E. coli in the Lenski long-term experiment duplicated an entire region of their genome, allowing them to digest citrate in the presence of oxygen, that was a loss of information. That seems unlikely to me, since they didn't lose anything, not even DNA. They kept their ability to digest it in the absence of oxygen. I guess you could say they lost the inability to digest citrate in the presence of oxygen, but I think everyone can see why that's a stupid way to phrase it.
So once again, do animals change? Yes, and we can see that change, but it's within these created kinds. It's within these genetic barriers, imagine, that God put in place as described in Genesis chapter 1 that prevents animals from gaining information and reproducing outside their created kinds.
Well, that's one hell of a sentence. We have two completely undefined terms, kind and information, and a whole new concept of genetic barriers that prevent creatures from gaining information, which again was not defined. You see, this yet again is why Christianity must be false, because they can't gain conflammation and cross into a new hyperdyne because of the divine barrier. Sorry, Christians, but we all know that the only one who can be the origin of conflammation is Ahura Mazda, and he also already created all the hyperdynes after his first argument with Angra Mainyu. That's it. There's no more conflammation you can get with your whole worshipping Jesus thing. Best convince the Zoroastrians to once again start accepting converts, because that's your only hope.
So evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. They have two different definitions.
Yes, that's true. They're not the same thing in much the same way that an engine and a car are not the same thing. Of course, one is a vital component of the other, but technically, they're not the same thing, even if I just make up things that don't exist or that I can't describe or measure about cars.
Here's just one more example from biology. I love this one when I came across this image. Now, if you look at this image, you're probably going to say, wow, that kind of looks like a woven basket, doesn't it? That's what it looks like. Imagine like a basket under the microscope.
I thought of feathers, but then again, I like birds, so maybe I'm just biased. But those fibers are clearly not woven in an alternating pattern, so I definitely don't think of a basket.
Well, what this actually is an electron micrograph of tooth enamel.
Unironically cool.
And when they described it in the article, they actually said it looks like a woven basket. So teeth owe their strength and flexibility to the interweaving of mineralized rods.
Okay, is there a point? Or is this just, look at the trees, except it's teeth instead of trees? Cool thing doesn't on its own provide evidence for God just on the basis that it's cool.
Well, you know, it's not just tooth enamel that looks like a woven basket under the microscope. Our entire human body does.
I guess if she's talking about collagen fibers and cytoskeletons, then yes, that's true. Both are basically a bunch of crisscrossing fibers all over the place.
Our tissues look like a woven basket.
No, most of them are just sheets of cells.
You know, Psalms...
For a Christian here, Jen really sucks at the Bible. It's Psalm, singular, because it's a psalm from the book of Psalms. That name isn't just there as a goof. It actually describes the damn collection. And yeah, if she can't get the reference right, we're not listening to her Bible bit. She just points out that the psalm says that God knits people together in the womb, which apparently is profound because human tissue is woven together. Which, no, it's mostly not.
Now let's dive into a little bit of geology. Geology is a study of the earth.
That's the etymology. but more specifically, it's the study of Earth's history, physical structure, physical makeup, and the forces that shaped it and act on it. Meteorology also studies the Earth, just a different part. Geology is basically the study of rocks and minerals, how they form, how they got where they are now, and so on.
And here's what they found when we talk about fossils. Seashells have been found from shore to shore on mountaintops and places in between all over the world, and to the point where Mount Everest, at its summit, contains fossils.
Which on its own is actually a problem for a flood, because floods have to deal with this thing called gravity, which means that they tend not to really deposit things like fossils or sediments on top of mountains. Further, the Himalayas are made of folded rock from the area that was once between the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. This means that the whole thing is made of marine sediments, including evaporites. Ever get that pink Himalayan salt? Yeah, that stuff is pink because of fossilized algae. And how do you get giant deposits of salt with algae? Well, a sea has to dry up. Pray tell, how does a sea dry up underneath a flood?
What event, right, does this directly confirm? The fact that we find seashells all over the earth and on the summit of Mount Everest.
The collision of the Indian plate with the Eurasian plate some 45 million years ago.
Genesis 7:18 through 19 clearly describes such event, right? It tells us that the waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. All the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered.
It takes more than being covered in water to form fossils, especially to explain the fossil strata we see on Everest. Not only is there the aforementioned problem with evaporites, further, some of the fossil-bearing layers in the Himalayas are in situ, meaning that they grew and were fossilized where they lived as a community in an ecosystem. How do you even establish a functional ecosystem with generations of creatures on a mountain in a raging flood in under a year? Yeah, that's right. You can't. Simply noting that fossils exist on a mountain is far from sufficient to say that the fossils formed when there was a flood tall enough to cover the mountain, especially when the processes that form the Himalayas, that is, uplift from the buckling of the rock of the Indian and Eurasian plates, is still going on today, and we can watch it happen. Meaning that when we play it backwards, as expected, the rock that's up there now would be underwater, not because of a flood, but because of being below sea level.
So do we have a global event on this earth?
We've had a bunch of them, but so far all we've been shown to demonstrate that one of them was a global flood was stuff that actually argues against a flood if you bother to examine it for more than a few seconds.
Yes, we did. The Bible's clear about that.
Once again, the Bible isn't evidence in science. It's not data. If you want to support the Bible with your science, you can try, but you can't use the text itself to be evidence. You actually have to find physical evidence in the real world. Too bad for Ken Ham and his pals that when Christians actually started looking for evidence of the flood, they came back empty-handed.
All the mountains are covered up to 15 cubits deep. Should we expect to find marine fossils all over the face of the earth? Yes, we should.
Actually, no. Specifically, we shouldn't expect to find them in places like the tops of tall mountains, because they would have been swept away. And further, we shouldn't expect to be able to find deposits of fossils that are purely terrestrial. Yet, we do. In North America, we have the Morrison Formation, which is primarily a desert formation and has no marine fossils. There's also the Dakota Formation in Mongolia, which is similarly a desert formation with no marine fossils. If all these were actually flood deposits, then these terrestrial organisms would have been swept into the water along with all the fish from the ocean, and we should not have this type of segregation of terrestrial and marine organisms.
Right? We could make that prediction and clearly see how it confirms God's word.
Except that one, the prediction is wrong because there are places we shouldn't expect to see marine fossils if the flood were true. But two, even ignoring that, the prediction fails because there are also places that should have marine fossils if the flood is true that don't. This idea fails on both ends.
Now, here's something fascinating too when we look at fossils is that, for a long time, I would say the narrative was out there that fossilization occurs very slowly. That's what secular scientists say, that an organism dies and it sinks to the bottom of a lake or river, and then it's slowly layered by sedimentary processes and pressure, and it's fossilized.
So, this is a vast oversimplification of fossilization in the sense of the replacement of the original biomaterial with mineral, that is, permineralization. More specifically, it happens at different rates in different conditions, and under some conditions it happens fairly quickly. But also, the rate at which an organism is covered in sediment can also vary, and the covering in sediment and the permineralization rate are not really tightly coupled, except that the permineralization has to be slower than the sedimentation because it can't happen in places that aren't covered in sedimentation. The sedimentation itself also has to happen more quickly than the decay rate, or there is nothing to be permineralized. But in some cases, all of this can happen fairly quickly, such as in an undersea sediment slump, which can trap organisms living at the bottom under multiple meters of muck that itself took millennia to deposit. This can form fossils in an area where sedimentation is normally too slow and decay removes organisms from the environment before they can be permineralized. On the other hand, at the bottom of an anoxic lagoon, where decay is glacially slow, even a slow deposition of silt can be well fast enough to allow for fossilization. Once an organism is covered, permineralization can start, and how long it takes varies, but it also isn't a factor in dating fossils. I should also point out that not all fossils are permineralized. Bones and shells are already basically made of rock, being biomineralized. Further, some fossils are actually not body fossils, but impressions left by a body, making them like a 3D version of a photographic negative. In these cases, there is simply no permineralization to worry about.
But that's not what we observe when something dies. As a forensic scientist, I can tell you, when something dies within 10 minutes of death, stuff's moving in to break that organism down.
Interesting. Jennifer is here saying that the processes we see today should inform our conclusions about the past. At the beginning of the talk, she said how it was something only so-called secular scientists did. But here, where she thinks it's convenient suddenly, the present is the key to the past. How does she know that this is how decay worked in the past, if we can't use the same logic with geology? Well, I guess when it comes to the triangle, we know that Jennifer didn't pick honest. But further, forensic science focuses primarily on what happens to human bodies in the conditions most likely to be encountered after criminal homicide. As you may be surprised to learn, those are not the same conditions that usually lead to fossilization. Most criminal people who unalive people, thank YouTube for ridiculous words I have to use, tend not to put people in places like anoxic lagoons, at the bottom of the ocean where they then trigger a sediment slump, out on the desert, etc. So, while Jennifer's hypocritical impulse to actually do science here, while condemning it elsewhere, is a good one, she is simply assuming that processes are the same under conditions we know to change those processes.
Right? We have insects moving in, we have other animals moving in.
Not if there's not enough oxygen, or were they just buried under several meters of sediment, killing them too.
And as part of God's, system that we see for decomposition.
Say hello to JTA. A240, a mummified human head that's approximately 6,000 years old, found in Argentina. Technically, this is a subfossil that is about 4,000 years away from being a true fossil. But I want to note that this time frame is far longer than we have available according to Jen's estimate, and it was simply found in the open, as are many desert mummies, because some environments are fundamentally unsuited to decomposers. Indeed, the first pre-dynastic Egyptian mummies were simply buried in the desert, and you are probably familiar with mummies of animals like woolly mammoths, which are indeed fossils. We also have mummies associated with Lake Natron in Kenya. It's trivially easy to find places today where Jen's assumptions about fossilization and decay are violated. And these are places where fossils are forming now. In fact, that mummified human head would have been a fossil if it had simply been found a bit later, rather than being found when it was.
But what they're noticing and starting to, I would say, is definitely out there in the narrative a lot, is that fossilization actually has to occur very rapidly. It doesn't take long periods of time to fossilize, and we've actually observed this.
That's true.
It doesn't have to take a long time. I'm not sure what this is an argument for, since fossils are not thought to be old because it takes a long time to form a fossil, although it can take longer than Jen is implying.
But if you look at this example here, we have just so many layers of detail in this particular fossil. We know it had to happen rapidly. And in this actual article, they were trying to say that these two creatures died together and sank and were slowly layered. I'm like, there is no way. Nature just doesn't work like that.
It observably does, though. So first, this fossil is from the Solnhofen limestone, a Lagerstätte, in Germany. And you may be surprised to learn that the nearly 2-decade-old link provided for this claim doesn't work. So I had to look up the fossil and find the PLOS paper it's from, which is linked in the description. That's also how I know where this fossil is from. Now, as the name might imply, the Solnhofen limestone is a biogenic limestone from the late Jurassic. Biogenic limestone has an observed maximum deposition rate of only a few centimeters per millennium. Theoretically, this could be sped up if there was a process of flocculation, but this would result in visible floccules in the sediment, which, you can see are not there, because the matrix surrounding the fossil is smooth, fine-grained limestone. During the late Jurassic, Europe was a chain of islands surrounded by a shallow sea of lagoons. The Solnhofen limestone formed in one such lagoon, which, because of how stagnant and murky it was at the bottom, had almost no free oxygen, making it anoxic. This happens in lagoons today. As a result, anything that died in the lagoon and sank to the bottom rotted extremely slowly, as the only decomposers that could get at them were anaerobic bacteria, which are extremely slow. So slow that the deposition of limestone from the bodies of algae was more than fast enough to cover these fossils. Again, this happens today in similar lagoons, although we don't have as many because the sea levels are much lower, meaning that we don't really have the same continent-spanning lagoon systems that were around in the Jurassic. So, if Jennifer is simply wrong in saying that this isn't how nature works, even though it's how it still works, but further, if she wants to say that this biogenic, non-flocculated limestone is the result of a flood, she's going to need the sedimentation experiments that allow for a flood to deposit limestone, such as the limestone forming the matrix of this fossil. Everything we know about the physics of sedimentation and water flow says that this is physically impossible. I wish her luck.
So what we have here is a fish, and in that fish's mouth is a pterosaur.
Specifically, this is a Rhamphorhynchus pterosaur, and the fish is Aspidorhynchus, a ganoid fish.
And when they did further scans of the pterosaur, they found that in its stomach is a little ostracod or shrimp.
Not according to the paper. The paper indicates that the gut contents of the Rhamphorhynchus are the remains of an unidentified and partially digested fish, and in the animal's throat are the mostly intact remains of another fish. Crustaceans are only mentioned as part of the potential identity of the animals found in the gut of the pteranodon, an animal found halfway around the world in North America. Ostracods are not mentioned anywhere in the paper. Why is she just lying about this? I really don't get it. Creationists are so sloppy. Like it wouldn't cost her any rhetorical points to just get this part right. But once again, we find a creationist getting stuff wrong that doesn't even matter. I get it that they have to lie about some things, like whether this rock could be a flood deposit, or when they create an absurd straw man of actual science. But then they'll just lazily make up things like this that don't matter, but that also undermine their credibility for no reason.
So here's what I imagine happens.
Oh good, I'll look into the mouth of madness.
The pterosaur wants lunch. It sees a shrimp in the water.
A fish. It was a fish. But okay.
The pterosaur is diving down to the water to scoop up the shrimp. He's successful. But then there's a bigger fish in the water that sees the pterosaur, grabs in its mouth, and then they had to have been immediately buried in sediment very quickly.
There are some problems with that. First, the fish is most of the way down the pterosaur's throat, which means that the pterosaur had to be swallowing, which implies it probably was not still in the water, since the lower jaw of Rhamphorhynchus seems to have been able to dip into the water without the rest of the body entering. Specifically because this is safer for the animal. This means that Aspidorhynchus probably leaped out of the water to get the pterosaur. It's actually not clear what killed the fish. But we know that this couldn't simply be a bunch of limestone sediment washing over them, because that's physically impossible for the bodies of algae to do. How did so much algae even come into existence at once? Remember, this is biogenic limestone. That means it's physically made of algae skeletons. As they reproduce, they bring in calcium from the seawater to build calcium carbonate shells. And as they die, the shell sinks to the bottom, forming limey muck, which eventually solidifies into limestone. Just having that much lime suspended in a column of water to then crash on the fish would be a problem, because it would be so thick that the algae that produced such sediment couldn't even grow because there'd be no light for them. And of course, even if there were such a collection of sediment, it might drown the fish by clogging its gills. But the sediments are so small that just Brownian motion is enough to keep them suspended in the water for years, longer than the entire duration of the flood. So nothing about Jennifer's story is physically possible after the point where the fish grabs the pterosaur.
To get this level of detail, there's absolutely no way that a membranous pterosaur who has wings, that these organisms in a fish are going to sink, right? That's not going to happen when something dies, is they are going to float, and then they would have been ripped apart, especially because if they were in water.
That depends entirely on the relative densities of the animals. Now, for the pterosaur, that was pretty low, but we don't know that for the fish. Most fish in life are neutrally buoyant. The ones that you see floating in the fish tank post-mortem are doing so because of decay gases. If what killed the fish broke the skin, then it's possible decay gases would not build up to an appreciable level, allowing it to sink. Further, we know that the decay processes in the area were much slower than we're used to because of the conditions in the lagoon that are needed simply to produce the limestone the fossils were found in. But further, if the problem she has is that the fish would have floated, then it's unlikely that unconsolidated limestone would have prevented that. So if this is a problem for science, it's equally a problem for her idea of a flood geology.
So we know they had to have been buried very quickly.
Well, I look forward to sedimentation studies that show the possibility of the rapid deposition of biogenic lime without flocculation. It will involve breaking fairly basic laws of physics, so I won't be holding my breath, but I'm sure it will happen eventually.
Well, how does this directly confirm God's word?
It doesn't.
Well, once again, we can go to Genesis. Genesis 7:11 tells us on that day,
God invented the Slurpee, and he drank the Slurpee which he had made, and he tasted that it was good.
all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So we have the crust of the earth breaking open.
Yeah, allowing the cosmic ocean below the flat earth to well into the earth without needing to displace air, of course, because in the Iron Age, no one knew that air was particulate matter that needed to be displaced.
And the windows of heaven were opened, and we know it rained 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah, those windows in the dome over the flat earth that open to let in the waters of the cosmic ocean above the dome. You see why maybe taking Genesis literally is not so great an idea. There are no windows in the sky because the sky isn't a solid thing that can have windows in it.
So we have a catastrophic, cataclysmic event on this earth.
We have indeed had some of those. Unfortunately for Jen, a global flood wasn't one of them. And showing a fossil that a flood is physically incapable of producing isn't exactly a slam dunk bit of evidence for such an event.
Where we had large amounts of sediment accumulating very quickly. Imagine tsunami-type forces bearing millions of organisms in the level of detail that we can see in the fossil evidence.
You know, not everyone knows this, but tsunamis actually leave behind a special kind of rock. It's called tsunamite. They tend to be made of graded sand with floating mudstone clasts and hummocky, which basically means made of gentle bumps, cross stratification. Guess what? The limestone in the Solnhofen quarry lacks all of those features. So, what possible reason beyond wishful thinking could Jen have for saying that this rock is a tsunamite? You got it. None. In fact, it's not even made of sand. So that's a bit of a problem.
Another example where we see geology confirms the Bible is in the Mount St. Helen eruption.
Bold of her to use the word another.
We saw that in a single day, a canyon of over 150 feet deep was carved out.
Actually, I can't find any indication that this happened in a day, and there isn't even a canyon. Like, it's the system of gorges that have no common name around the Toutle River west of Spirit Lake at the foot of Mount St. Helens. It did happen rather quickly. This gorge, which you can see on screen is smooth-sided, is at most about 20 meters deep, and is all made from loose volcanic ash. The Grand Canyon is made of near vertical sides of hardened rock, including sandstone, shale, limestone, and deeper down, things like schist. The problem is that the gorge Jen is talking about, having been carved from what's basically dense powder rather than rock, has smooth sides and cannot support vertical slopes. That's what we see in the Grand Canyon. Many instances that are so vertical that one of the layers is called the red wall limestone, because of just how vertical it tends to be, and also because of the reddish dust it accumulates. The Grand Canyon cannot have been carved into powder, And so we have to deal with the erosion of already consolidated rock. And that's going to take a lot longer than a few days. Which is something you might know if you live near a river and have seen the same rocks in it for decades. Solid rock doesn't tend to simply erode away in days.
You know, because they try to tell us that, like, the Grand Canyon, for example, was carved out over a long period of time, right? That it took millions of years to carve out the Grand Canyon.
Well, it took more than 1,000,000, but by how much isn't super clear. It might have not taken 2,000,000 years. Broadly speaking, the Grand Canyon is a fairly recently created structure.
Well, we saw canyon formation, 1/40th the size of Grand Canyon, formed in a single day.
Well, if you want to call that little thing a canyon, then yes. But given the vast differences in the physical structure of the canyon and the differences in what the sides are made of, these formations are in fact not very analogous, beyond both being water erosion features.
Would Grand Canyon have formed very quickly? Yes, there's no question about it, and we've directly observed that.
Except we didn't. A gorge forming in fresh, unconsolidated ash is a worlds away from a canyon that was carved through, in some places, more than 1 mile of solid rock. But let's get to her other things when Dapper gets back. I don't want to do too much of his job for him. Well, if you did like this video, hit like and tell me in the comments. If you didn't, feel free to hit dislike and tell me what the problem was in the comments. Is it me? Is it the change of narrator? Either way, please remember to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you're always notified when Dapper has more content. I'm not Dapper Dinosaur, but he'll be back. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Phil Rivara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Denny5252, Ellerhan Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Monkey They Them, Sphincter of Doom, Ita V, Strawberry Vein, and Star Runner. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.